And I'm going to interview the guest owner here, Kim Newman.
Hi.
So, let's start here. First of all, welcome to Norway and welcome to Norcon 27.
Okay, I'm very glad to be here.
So, Kim Newman is our guest owner. He's a film critic, a horror film historian of sorts, and of course a writer.
This, when did you know you were a writer? And he said, no, when I was young, I thought I was going to grow up to be a pirate or a sailor or a hero. And said, yeah, no. But when did you think you were going to be a writer? He says, oh no, I was always a writer. It was like the taste of water in my mouth. And that's kind of it. I've always written. I can't remember a time when I didn't. I mean, obviously, when I was really young, I wanted to be a fireman. Yeah, but once I realised I was too cowardly to do that, and then, I sort of came into being a writer, and this is very much in my teens. I went through a period of thinking I wanted to be an actor, a performer, and I realised that I would probably do best. Somebody had to write the plays as well to show me off. And so I became a writer in order to give myself something to say. And when the acting sort of didn't work out, I was still doing the writing. I mean, I ended up, I didn't end up, in my late teens, early 20s, I worked with a theatre group. And I ended up being the writer for the theatre group because I was the only person I trusted to do it. And while doing that, the parts I wrote for myself got smaller and smaller and smaller, and sort of then disappeared. And I realised that I was, primarily writing, and all the way through I've been writing prose stuff as well. And there just came a point where I was going to stick with this. Also, I mean, I've been writing criticism too, and I sold my first story almost in the same week as I first placed non-fiction, as I was first sold reviews to film magazines. And so I've been, those have been entwined throughout my career. I'm not one of those people who's just doing one thing until the other thing takes off, so I can stop. I am committed to both.
So we can continue about with beginning of your writing career. You worked for the magazine City Limits and what can I say, the men's journal Nave.
No, porn magazine, softcore. I mean, I worked for lots of things. I worked for the New Statesman, which is still a left-leaning journal comment. I wrote These Were Smash Hits, which was a teenage pop magazine. I worked for the NME. This was what you did as a freelance writer. You worked with whoever you had. And to an extent, I still do that. I have if you look at the list of magazines I work for, it's quite eclectic. And yes, I wrote a lot for men's magazines. It was Neil Gaiman who started that. He was the first of our little gang, as it were, to start selling stuff to porn magazines. And the first thing he did was he started selling interviews with science fiction writers, because he liked science fiction writers and wanted to talk to them. And what happened, Nave for a while actually had two editors, one called Ian and one called Rupert, and they both happened to be big science fiction fans. And back then, what girly magazines were was pictures of naked women and then articles between them. And whatever the editor was actually interested in would be the articles. So if you had an editor who was a big football fan, then there'd be lots of interviews with football players and managers and stuff. And as it happened, we had Ian was a big science fiction fan, and Rupert was a big film fan. And so they started buying. Neil would interview writers, and I would interview filmmakers and solve that. And that developed a bit. They asked us, or we decided we'd start writing the funny articles that went between the pictures of naked girls. And so, with a couple of other people, Eugene Byrne, who's also a novelist as well, was one of them, we wrote lots and lots of humorous pieces magazines. We thought they were funny. They were a bit less funny when they appeared in print and been fiddled around with a bit. But no, for a couple of years we would get together every couple of months and just write a bunch of funny, pieces. We became quite good at it, but there wasn't really a market for it that anybody would know would admit to reading. So it didn't really go anywhere. But it was frankly, when we were starting out, like all freelance writers, you need some kind of income. And the men's magazines were just reliable. They paid slightly better than the kind of lefty alternative press type magazines that like City News, which, again, we all work for things like that. And they were enormous consumers of stuff. They had to get out every month, and Nave also published Fiesta and a couple of others. So they had to fill those pages. And I think shortly after we stopped, I actually haven't seen a copy of any of those magazines since then. I think they sort of thought, why are we bothering to put all these articles no one reads? We could just put more pictures of naked women in. And in fact, I think that's what happened to the magazines after we left. It was it was actually quite a positive experience. Certainly, I met worse people in mainstream straight publishing. I saw more terrible things being done at what you would think of as respectable, politically progressive magazines than I ever did in the, as it were, in the softcore side of things. I don't really have that much of a career as a pornographer, or I didn't. It didn't get filmed, but I wrote an X-rated movie script for Lars von Trier's company a couple of years back, which again was an interesting thing. I kind of knew it wasn't going to happen while I was doing it, but it was I met some interesting people and some terrible people. And I sort of have no shame about doing that. Neil also is happy to admit, all the stuff. Partly because we didn't write the porn. So we didn't have to deal with that side of things. And we didn't really have that much involvement with the rest of the magazine.
Fun product, I suppose. Which actually, to go a bit ahead here, one of your first published books was a non-fiction. It was Ghastly Unbelievable horror literature.
No. That was a humour book. It was me and Neil wrote this thing. It was a book of funny quotations from book. Neil did the books and I did the films. And it was one of those surefire ideas everybody thought was hilarious, but nobody bought the book. It's like we had a very supportive editor. It was a paperback from Arrow. And she thought it was a really funny idea, and we thought it was a really funny idea, and it came in, and we all giggled and laughed and quoted bits of each other and all this all the time. And then it came out and had a really nice cover as well. I was really pleased with the cover, and it just sort of kind of disappeared. But I mean, it was an interesting thing to have done. I know every time Neil and I have occasionally a thought of, should we bring it out again? But no, because it was done before the internet, and it was probably done a little before the availability of films on VHS. So a lot of it isn't terribly accurate. A lot of it is notes scribbled down in cinemas, and it would be really wearisome to go and correct jokes. And so I think we're happy that it's a high-priced, hard-to-find collector's item for both of us. So it was a nice little thing, but like I say, we didn't get much money for it. It didn't earn out that advance, and I believe it was mostly donated to Australia. And Australians are big fans of that book because they were able to pick up loads and loads of copies cheap. But no, it was one of those things you do at the beginning of your career. And it did, it established as irritating people in the field as well, which I think is probably useful.
Well, which also brings us to another non-fiction book that's more renowned, which I actually have read as compared to Lost Beyond Belief, which is Nightmare Movies.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Which is a large tome regarding the history of horror films.
Yeah, it's a very large tome. I think another one included the first one. Yeah. Yeah, that was. I suppose that's my first book. It's the first book that actually came out that I worked on. Although it's been out in several variant editions, and it's only really the latest one, which is sort of finished. Yeah, no, then that was a study of the horror film since 1968. At the time I started writing it, the few sort of really solid, serious books about horror had been written either in 1968 or before 1968, so they ended there. They were tended to be written by people who loved old Universal monster movies and thought modern films were terrible. And of course, as a kid growing up, yeah, it's depressing reading these sort of histories that tell you all the things you like are rubbish. And this was a time when people were dismissing, I don't know, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or all these films which are now classics, were thought of as kind of disposable and terrible.
Because this was actually it was actually not too many years after the Video Nazis.
Oh no, it was the first edition was absolutely during the Video Nazis.
Yeah.
I was like the first person to write seriously about the Driller Killer, for instance. Yeah. Oh, so yeah, it's. I think the book does come out of that period. It's a book written in the 80s. Although I think in the end it's mostly about 1970s horror. Looking at it as if it contributes anything to what's now critical orthodoxy, it's the idea that 1970s horror was exciting and relevant and socially engaged, and 1980s horror was kind of gross out, silly and cartoonish. But it was very much involved with the sort of the censorship of all the media nasty era. And a few years back, I republished the original book, but as the first half of a big thick book, which also includes a section covering the 20 years since its first publication. It will probably be another 20 years before I can get my head around doing it again. It's an enormously demanding and difficult thing. Fiction is so much easier than this kind of non-fiction, where you don't have to look up and confirm every single date 2 or 3 times and make sure that the accents are right in all the film titles and all this kind of stuff. And also just the sheer amount of watching stuff and taking notes that goes into it. It's very demanding. I mean, I love doing books like that, but I'm not sure I could actually afford in my time to. It's like that's actually been quite a successful book for what it is. I got a reasonable advance and I've received royalties on it, but I don't think there is enough money to pay for the hours, that you put into something like that. Just if you factor in the watching films,
Well, actually, you have a point there. I have the latest edition from 2011, and it's actually a very large book.
Yeah, it is. I mean, to be fair, that's 2 books together, and we ummed and ahed about whether to publish it again in 2 volumes. But I thought the problem with that was that the first volume would probably seem a bit disappointing because it was the book all people already had, but with a few footnotes. And it was the second volume, what people really wanted. Although I'd underestimated how, in the 20 years since publication of Nightmare Movies, how many new people had come along who were now interested, for whom this was the first time they'd read it. So, yeah, no, that may well have been one of the good things about it. There are, again, that's a very positive experience. I have this thing that I think I'm very fortunate. If you talk to a lot of writers, I'm trying to think of someone who won't be upset if I say this. Yeah, talk to Peter Straub, who's a great American writer. And he says that like 80% of people who come up to him and talk to him talk about one book, Ghost Story, which is a great book. He's written a huge library of other books, and much as he loves Ghost Story and likes it, there's a bit inside him think, what? Don't you like Floating Dragon or Coco or any of these other things? Yeah, seriously. Yeah. But because I've written in so many different fields, I don't tend to get that. I get people who come up and they only know Nightmare movies. They don't even know I write fiction. Or people who know Anno Dracula, which has been republished recently, so that tends to be the one. But I've got a couple of other things. I mean, there's a novel I did called Life's Lottery, which is kind of mainstream and it's a choose-your-own adventure book and a bit outside the field. People talk to me about that and don't necessarily know science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And then I wrote the Jack Yeovil books for Warhammer. Some people were amazed to find out that Jack Yeovil wasn't a real person and I'd done other stuff. So I get, there's a fair amount of love for all of the things I've done spread around, which means that at least I have a slightly more varied career. I get to talk about, I don't just have to talk about Anarchy all the time.
So actually, we can talk a bit about the novels you did for Games Workshop. As you said, you had a set named Jack Evil, where you wrote for basically two of the universes that Games Workshop has, which is Warhammer Fantasy universe and the Dark Future, which are actually now the defunct setting that they don't publish anymore.
Yeah, no, they did. Outside of what I wrote, I don't think they did. I think there were two other novels and there was a collection of short stories. And then they had sort of reconfigured it to make it a bit cyberpunk. But basically, I made all that stuff up. It is whatever, 3/4 of it was stuff. Of the background stuff is mine. I probably shouldn't have done that because I basically gave them the rights to this series that now, because they screwed up the republishing, they could never finish. So it's like the first, I don't know, it was 4 books of a 6-book projected series and they could never finish it, which is a bit frustrating for people who figured out now, but it was a fun thing to do.
Because the Dark Future setting is an alternate history setting.
Yes, that's right.
For instance, you have Elvis Presley as a bounty hunter, and where JFK didn't got killed, but he had to leave after his relationship, his affair with Marilyn Monroe got public.
Yeah, that was the what again. That I think that wasn't me. I think that was David Pringle, who was the editor, had that idea, but that wasn't in the original game. And I think what it was, and this is actually how things work. They originally invented this world to be a Mad Max type world of the future with loads of people driving around the desert in cars, shooting people off. But by the time it came to doing the books, the dates they had advanced for the downfall of society had passed, and so it de facto became an alternate world. And so when I came along, and with David and Eugene Byrne again, who was to have written one of these books, and Alex Stewart wrote another one, we sort of worked out, we projected their future history. We took what they had written and worked it out back into the past as to how we could have a world like this. It was still set in the future, but only like a couple of years. And by the time they republished them, they had gone past the date, so it was an alternate present. And so when they republished them, they bumped all the dates up to be in the future again, which screwed my timeline, and also meant that the projected finale of the book, which was set at the eve of the millennium, could no longer happen. So they republished this series and shot themselves in the foot at the same time. I thought they should just change the title. I thought Dark Future was too generic anyway, because it wasn't really about the future. But they copyrighted it and had a big lawsuit about it, so they felt rather fond of it and stuck with it. But that, again, that's what happens when you write for hire, for commissioned work for somebody else's world. You don't get final say. And I would recommend it for writers starting out. I mean, it's great fun, and again, it was good. It was a reliable payday when we all needed it. But at some point, you have to move on beyond it. I certainly think that I remember some of the older writers who signed up to do some of these things were more cynical than we were about it. I remember somebody saying, "Oh, you're working much too hard on these books." I said, "No, I spent 3 weeks on this thing." You know, it's like, yeah, I know you should over a weekend or whatever. But those writers' books weren't as well liked by the fans, and I don't think, because I think that the readership sensed that they were, you know, the wheels were being spun in order to be like, and there was a certain sort of underlying contempt for it. And I think you can have fun with somebody else's premise. I think you need to sort of kick against the world that they've given you a bit, but you can't sort of be ashamed of it. You can't sort of, you know, go through and say, "Oh, this is silly," and I'll just write loads of axe hacking and hope that it pays off in the end. And actually, I think the author who came out of that line most successfully was Ian Watson, who picked the Warhammer world that none of the rest of us wanted to write because the rules were too complicated, and made a real go of it and connected with the audience. But that was a little after I moved on to do other things.
Which was actually the reason why I took up the Dark Future is that, in a way, it kind of precedes what you are renowned for, which is alternate realities, which brings us to Annie Dracula, which now is kind of a mainstay in alternate reality genre, and also the steampunk. Annie Dracula has its mark in.
It was a little bit. Actually, I suppose. K.W. Jeter and James Blaylock published their books before Annie Dracula came out. Yeah. But steampunk wasn't a big thing then, and I'm not entirely sure if I'm comfortable sticking into that as a mode. But yeah, it's certainly a fantasy in the Victorian setting, and it features characters borrowed from literature, and it has an alternate world element to it, and lots of the themes that come from steampunk. It's not very interested in technology. It's not as a series. It's not. I don't really alter history that much. I think the whole point is to show what actually happened, but through a kind of weird distorting mirror. So quite often I stick quite closely to real events, or if I diverge from them, I pull it back. It's just, but with monsters. You know, that's the thing. It's like World War I, but with monsters. And so
because we have actually took the Dracula series also from the end of the 1800s through World War I and to the 1950s in Dracula Cha-Cha-Cha.
That's right. I'm now up to about 1990. I think that's the most recent. That Fall of Berlin Wall is where the last book kind of finishes. So yeah, I wanted to embrace the century rather than confine myself to this side of gaslight, fog, cans and cabs world. Although I loved that. I mean, I'm very fond of that as a
because in a way, with Annie Dracula, after Annie Dracula, there's been a quite steady flux of movies, novels, comic books that have alternate realities mixed with, where you mix different characters from literature and films. Like, for instance, the most prominent example of this is Alan Moore's The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Yeah, it's one of those things. That element of Annie Dracula came in very casually. Obviously, I knew I was going to use the characters from Bram Stoker, but I also knew I wanted to use the Jack the Ripper murders as a kind of historical spine for the story. And it's just when I started writing it, I had this real problem. I mean, I was looking at the calendar and all of the events of the murders, and I just wanted to know which murder to start with. Where in chapter 1, who's going to die? And none of the historical murders fit what I needed from the plot. And then I remembered that there's a fictional one. There's Lulu from Pandora's Box is a Jack the Ripper victim who's not one of the historical set. And then I realized that actually Lulu from Pandora's Box, Louise Brooks in the film, actually means a lot more to me than any of the historical Jack the Ripper victims. So I put her in as the first victim. And that led me to the, this is a world where there are lots of characters from various fictions. That's where Mr. Hyde and Inspector Lestrade and all that. And so then that just became a big thing in the series. I have to say, if Leave Extraordinary Gentlemen had come out first, I wouldn't have done it. I would have used historical characters or made up more characters of my own. But because I started first and established it, I felt sort of obliged to keep up with it. But that's what happens when we're working in a very small field and treading on each other's toes.
Yeah, now we got a message on my head that we're running a bit out of time.
Well, if you want to come back for my guest of honor interview, which is basically this interview continued.
I think you should do that.
Yeah.
You should.
So just come. Do you want to come back and where it is at 5 o'clock and sit and just ask me the rest of the questions? For people who weren't here, we'll do a bit of a recap before.
Yeah. Okay. So we can do a second part.
Cool.
Previously on Kim Newman.